I'm Laura from Kitty Makes It. Today we're going to finish working on our Relaxed Peplum by Mama Can Do It pattern. On day one, we did printing and assembling of the PDF pattern. I used 8.5 by 11 paper, printed, used a glue stick, put it together, and cut the pattern pieces out. On day two, we paused a little bit to make adjustments to the paper pattern pieces. So we did full bust adjustments, sway back adjustment, height adjustments for women and girls, and we talked about grading or blending between sizes. Then we laid out the fabric, talked about how to cut it with a rotary cutter and pattern weight. Today's day three. We're going to do the majority of the assembly today. This is an easy way for me to break up the workload because I actually use two different machines. I use a serger with a blade for the assembly, and then I use a cover stitch for the top stitching. So I've kind of broken up the workload into serger versus cover stitch, and today is serger. So the first thing you'll see is I have sewn the shoulder seams together on my front and back bodice. I lay out my bodice, and that's where I start attaching the sleeves. So I have an example here of how I put the sleeves on. Here's my bodice with my neckband. I like to start where I added a notch in the center. That was something during the pattern piece cutting. I added a little bit of a notch. I line that up with the center seam of the shoulder. Then I do one corner, lining up the sleeve and the edge of the arm side in the bodice. Then I usually line up the other so that I have 3 pins, one in the center and one on each side. I actually like to pick it up from my table at that point and kind of shake it out. And as I kind of shake it out, I pin in increments along as I connect each side to the center. So I head to my serger and I will attach my sleeves. I like to do them flat. Some people prefer in the round. I usually go by whichever the pattern calls for. In this case, I'm fortunate it is my favorite way, and we are doing it flat. So just going to attach all of these seams. And then while I'm actually sitting at my serger, I like to go ahead and pin the side seams at that point. So once I've put the sleeves on and the neckband on, I follow the sleeve to the end. I'm making a long sleeve in this pink. I'm making a 3/4 sleeve or elbow sleeve in the video. But I find the end of the sleeve and I fold that in half. And then I stretch it out until I find the seam where I've attached the sleeve, and I clip that together. And then I go through and I again keep shaking it out and incrementally clip from here. Then I do the bodice together down from the sleeve and keep pinning until I get down to the bottom hem. Do that on both sides, and then I run both through my machine. I also, after I've done the shoulder seams, find this to be a good time to put the neckband on as well. So in this case, it's actually a binding, not a neckband, but it's not all that different. So you have your binding piece. You're going to put that right sides together with your main bodice front and back. I like to find the back center of my bodice, and that's where I put the seam where I have sewn right sides together of the binding piece to form a loop. Once I line that up, I usually grab a spare piece of fabric and make a little loop here, and I use that for a tag. I do actually have custom printed tags that are really great and funny, but They're not as soft as the fabric that I use, and this just is so easy. I actually a lot of times grab a piece right off my serger that's coming off as seam allowance, and I fold that up and make that into the tag. So the first thing I do is put the binding right sides together with the bodice, with the center seam in the back center. I like to do that pin first, then reach, and I kind of shake out the item, and I shake out the band and the bodice, and I find the center of both, and I line those up, and I do the front center pin. Then I hold the bodice until the back center pin and the front center pin line up, and that's how I find the sides. Then I'll have my neckband quartered. From there, I pick 2 pins, I pick it up, I kind of shake it out, and that's how I find the 8th point. So I end up with a total of 8 pins in my binding. Something else that you're going to see me doing here is that I end up turning and using my actual sewing machine. What I'm doing here is just the gathering stitches on the skirt, because in this particular video I am making the gathered skirt option. If you're doing the full circle skirt or the half circle skirt, you wouldn't need to do this step. But after I've sewn the side seams together on each piece of the skirt, there's several ways to gather. One method that I believe the tutorial recommends is that you run the longest setting that your machine has straight stitch along the entire skirt in the round, and then you pull those bobbin threads until the width of your skirt matches the width of your bodice. In my case, my preferred method is actually to turn the tension up, and here's a picture of my settings on my machine. I turn my tension almost all the way up, but I'm on the longest length straight stitch that I have, and that pre-gathers it. It ruffles it a little bit as I'm sewing it, and I have found that at a tension somewhere between 7.5 and 8, I have a happy medium of gathering as much as I want without those threads breaking. So I haven't had to do much in the way of pulling those threads together. So you'll see right here in my lap, I sit and match up the side seams on the skirt with the side seams on the bodice first. Then I find the center, front, and back until I have 4th. And again, do my 8th method. This is how I attach the skirt in the round to the bodice. Then I'm just going to use my serger to attach that. If you're using a sewing machine for all of the steps, this all works fine too. I would recommend using a zigzag stitch for everything except the gathering so that you get more stretch. And then for hemming, if you have a twin needle, that would be a really good option too, so that you get plenty of stretch. So the other thing I do is I like to space out my pinning because it's my least favorite activity. So sometimes I sort of reward myself for finishing sewing by pinning and getting it ready for hemming day. So tomorrow we're going to pause it for a minute and do a couple of hacks and show you how to do those. But then day 5 will be hemming. So if you wanted to work ahead, that would be totally fine. For hemming, you're going to hem the bottom, the sleeves, and you're going to turn the binding inside the bodice and top stitch that. So an example here, this isn't sewn yet, it's still pinned, but if you consider that once you sew, you'll create a seam allowance here, you're going to fold the binding over so that they're wrong sides together, but you're going to press the seam allowance up. So you're actually folding around that seam allowance, and then you push that down, and then you top stitch that. So I'll go over that again on hemming day. But again, you're going to want to push the seam allowance up, pull the binding over, and then just top stitch. The binding is actually kind of intimidating when you first start, but after one or two, all of a sudden it's my favorite method because it looks so clean. I like it a lot better than a wider neckband on most of my tops. So thank you for joining me for day 3 assembly. We've done all of the seams now on the peplum. All that's left is hemming. But we're going to stop and look at some other hacks that you can do just in case you wanted to do those. We'll all meet up together at the end of hemming day. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. I can't wait to see what you make. Thanks for joining me, and you can always find more on kittymakesIt.com.